Hi, and welcome to this episode of John's Model Kit Review. In today's fun model kit review video, we'll be looking at the Revell Monogram ProModeler Messerschmitt Me 410B in 1/48 scale. This is a ProModeler kit number 5936. This kit was released in 1997, and it has subsequently been reboxed as a Revell kit and also as a Hasegawa kit. In this review, we'll be taking a look at the in-process kit, and we'll talk about the construction of that. I'll give a brief history of the Messerschmitt Me 410B. We'll look at the kit instructions, and we'll talk about any problem areas to watch out for during the construction phase of this build. We'll also look at the small parts in the kit, and those include the landing gear and the parts that make up the interior of the kit. We'll look at the surface detailing on the exterior of the kit. We'll also talk about the fit of the major parts and how those go together. We'll take a look at the clear parts of the kit, and we'll talk about the fit and the clarity of those. We'll also talk about the marking options that are included with this kit. And we'll take a look at the decals themselves and talk about the quality and the performance of those. Looking at the history of the Messerschmitt Me 410, the Me 410 Hornice, or Hornet, was a planned successor to the famous Messerschmitt Bf 110. It was a light, fast bomber that evolved and adapted to many different roles. Originally designated the Me 210, the revisions to the engines, fuselage, and wing were so dramatic that the model was changed to Me 410 to prevent any confusion. The aircraft's potential to carry heavy armament made it a devastating bomber-destroyer. The Me 410 saw action in World War II from January 1943 until the end of the war. It was engaged in the defense of the Reich on all fronts. The Me 410 was powered by two 1,750 horsepower Daimler-Benz DB603A inverted V12 engines. It carried a crew of two and a whole host of armament options. These included different machine guns, different calibers of cannon, as well as bombs and wing-mounted rockets. An unusual feature of most of the Me 410s was the two rearward-firing 13mm MG 131 machine guns, which were mounted in movable barbettes on the fuselage sides. This remote-controlled armament system was designed to provide rear defense from attacking fighters. In practice, it proved to be unreliable and ineffective. Looking at the instructions, step 1 is the cockpit assembly. This is a multi-part step, and so in the first part of step 1, we are focused on the forward cockpit section. One thing to note in the instructions is that the control column is shown backwards. In this depiction, you want to flip that around the other way. Looking at the parts in the forward cockpit section, these parts are beautifully molded. Interestingly, there are some molded-in seatbelts on the lower seat portion, but there are no molded-in seatbelts on the upper seat portion. So I plan to use a set of Edward pre-painted photo-etch seatbelts on this build. The instructions include a picture of the interior of the actual aircraft, and this is very helpful in the painting and assembly process. Looking at the instrument panel, one thing to note is that the two parts of the panel are in two different planes, and so the right-hand part is a little bit closer to the pilot and the left-hand part is a little bit further away from the pilot. And the inside faces of each panel should be mounted vertically. In the second part of step 1, we're building the rear gunner's compartment. Right off the bat, we notice that part 60 on the rear of the right side of the cockpit, there is no positive locator for this part. To mount part 60 properly, you want to put the bottom surface against the floor of the cockpit, and you want to slide it rearward until it hits the small tab on the cockpit floor. In order to make sure that I got this assembly and the forward cockpit assembly mounted properly, what I did was to install the rear deck, and that is part 58 to the starboard side fuselage half. This allows me to check the fit of all of the parts as I install them. In this picture, you can see the rear gunner's compartment once it's installed into the cockpit. The detail on these parts looks excellent, and these should look great once they're detail painted. Step 2 covers the fuselage assembly. In the first part of step 2, we are mounting the single instrument gauge and the right side blast tube. In this photo, you can see how the instrument gauge should be placed. In the second part of step 2, we're mounting the left rear side panel. We're also mounting the left side blast tube and the trim wheel to the cockpit. This step of construction is very confusing. There are no positive locator marks for the left rear side panel. There's also no positive locator for the trim wheel. In this picture, you can see the proper locations for both the side panel and the trim wheel. This is a photo that shows where the trim wheel is located from the underside, and you can see there's a small box with a small shaft protruding from it, and the trim wheel mounts directly to that shaft. In the next part of step 2, we are closing up the fuselage halves around the interior assembly. I think the sequence that I did this in makes the most sense, and that is gluing the top deck, part 58, to the starboard side fuselage half, and then assembling the front cockpit and the rear cockpit, and then you can fit each cockpit section into the right side of the fuselage half, and everything lines up very nicely this way. It looks like we should be able to get a filler-free seam on the upper side of the fuselage, and it also looks like we'll be able to get a very good join line on the lower fuselage. The final part of step 2 is mounting the tail wheel to the aircraft. Looking at these parts, the detail on these is very nice, and these should look very good once they're detail painted. In step 3, we're building the cockpit details and nose guns. Once again, we have a multi-part step here. In the first part of step 3, we're working on the cockpit details. In this picture, you can see that I've added most of the cockpit details. These went on without a problem. The gun sight itself is very fiddly, and I'll probably leave that off until later on in construction. In the second part of step 3, we need to decide whether the aircraft we're building has the 20mm cannons or the 30mm cannons, and we need to add those. In the next section of step 3, we're adding the lower nose gun cover and the fuselage shell ejector panel. I don't anticipate any problems with these parts. Step 4 covers the machine gun barbettes. This is a pretty simple assembly, and I really don't anticipate any problems in this step of construction. In step 5, we're working on the wing assemblies. In the first part of step 5, we're boxing in the radiator wells, and we're also adding the oil cooler radiators. In the second part of step 5, we're adding the radiators themselves and the radiator covers. Once again, the instructions provide nice reference photos for these steps of construction. I have not fully completed this step, but I was able to glue the upper and lower wing halves together, and I was able to get a pretty decent fit all the way around on each of the wing assemblies. They will require a little bit of cleanup, but I don't anticipate using any putty on these seams. Step 6 covers the engine nacelle assemblies. I suggest taking your time and doing these one at a time and making sure that you get the exhaust shields correct. They are different from side to side. In the next part of step 6, we're mounting the completed nacelle assemblies to the lower section of the nacelles. I was able to get a great fit on each engine nacelle with a little bit of dry fitting. And just a note, I did have to trim the exhaust covers on each of the nacelles where the air intake comes out. I had to trim them just a little bit to get a good fit in these areas. Moving on, in step 7, we are building the airframe assembly, and that includes attaching the wings to the fuselage and the tailplanes to the fuselage. I was able to get a filler-free seam on the upper wing to fuselage join. I was also able to get a filler-free seam on the lower wing to fuselage join. This required a little bit of creative clamping as the glue set on the upper and lower wing seams. The tailplanes themselves mounted to the fuselage very, very nicely. The fit on these parts was just about perfect. In the second part of step 7, we're mounting the R4 gun pack. So you want to make sure that the plane you're modeling has this if you do build these. It also has us installing the landing light cover. In step 8, we're building the landing gear. The construction starts with the wheels themselves. It then moves to the landing gear assembly and adding the gear doors to the aircraft. Once again, we have some nice reference photos for this step of construction. And looking at the detail parts here, these parts look excellent. They have excellent detail on them, including brake lines, and I think these should look great with a coat of paint. The landing gear also mounts very securely into the wing, and I don't think you should have any problems with this step of construction. And a side note here, there are some ejector pin marks you can see in this photo, but those will not be visible on the finished assembly. In step 9, we're building the underwing rocket pods and installing those, and we're installing the horn balances to each wing. And that brings us to step 10. This is going to be one of those steps in construction where you really need to pay attention. Every review that I've read on this model kit mentions this step as being tricky, so you really want to take your time here. You really want to dry fit the parts. And because of the complicated gun sight, you have to build the rear canopy around the gun sight, and you really want to focus on the seam between the left and right canopy halves. Looking at the clear parts themselves, these seem to be very nicely molded. I don't see any molding glitches in these. And I would say the only downside on these is that they're a little bit on the thick side. I would highly recommend some Eduard canopy masks for this kit. And those are Eduard part number EX096. In step 11, we're moving on to the propeller assemblies. These should go together great. I don't anticipate any problems here. In step 12, we're adding the final details, and those include the boarding step and then the rear gunner. The molding on the rear gunner is excellent, as is the molding on the pilot figure that's included in this kit. If you're going to add seat belts to the seat, then you're going to have a very nice pilot figure to use on a different kit. Looking at the marking guide, there's a very nice common stencils marking guide that is applicable for every one of the decal options that's included with this kit. Looking at the decal options themselves, there are 3 different ME 410s represented by the markings in this kit. All of them are in the RLM 74, 75, 76 splinter camouflage, and all of them have the heavy modeling on the sides of the aircraft. Looking at the decals themselves, these seem to be nicely printed. I have read some reviews where the decals were really noticeably out of register. At first inspection, the ones in this kit seem to be in register. They're opaque, and they look like they'll perform pretty well. I've used a lot of Monogram decals in the past, and I've not had issue with them. Looking at the surface detail on the exterior of the kit, it is represented by very fine recessed panel lines. There's nice detail on the ailerons and on the rudder, and I think this kit will look great once it's finished painted and weathered. In conclusion, well, I think Revell Monogram has done another knockout job with this kit. I love the fact that it has so much detail packed into the interior of the kit without relying on a very heavy parts count and a lot of photo etch to do that. Once you know where the errors or vague spots are in the instructions for the interior, this is really a trouble-free build. I found the fit on the major parts to be excellent with a little bit of dry fitting, and I think this kit will turn out very nicely in the end. I highly recommend taking your time on the clear parts on this kit, as I think that's going to be one of the main challenges of the build. Detail-wise and fit-wise, this kit holds up very well, even when compared to the newer Meng offering of this aircraft in 1/48 scale. Because the ME 410 itself is a complicated aircraft with a somewhat complicated canopy on it, because the paint scheme on this aircraft is going to be a challenge, and because of some of the vagaries in the instructions of this kit, I would recommend this kit for more experienced modelers who want to put a really nice looking ME 410 on the shelf. Well, I'd love to know what you guys think. If any of you have built the Revell Monogram ProModeler or Hasegawa ME 410s, please feel free to comment in the comment section below. As always, I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and until next time, model on.